Next, though, Payment Protection Insurance, or PPI. For more than a decade, the banks routinely missold it to millions of customers who applied for loans and credit cards. Those banks have since had to set aside billions in compensation for customers entitled to refunds. So, why are the same banks turning down wholly legitimate claims by the thousands?
The big five banks, not always popular, and when it comes to judging PPI complaints, not always right. It took a High Court ruling last year to force them to compensate millions of customers who were missold the policy. And the amounts they've had to set aside to cover the claims are truly staggering. Santander reckons its compensation bill could hit £550 million, but that's nothing compared to its rivals. HSBC expects to pay out just over £1 billion. RBS thinks it needs £1.3 billion to cover the cost of claims, while Barclays reckons it will pay out £2 billion. But the daddy of them all is Lloyds. It's put aside a staggering £4.3 billion. So, the total bill for the Big Five? Just over £9 billion.
But although they've committed to use all of this money for repayments, in reality, some banks appear strangely reluctant to part with it. Despite all their promises to compensate everyone who has missold PPI, actually getting your money back can be remarkably difficult.
This is Nahida Goodchild from Ipswich. Unknown to her, Barclays sold her PPI when she took out a credit card with them in 1990.
I never had a conversation with anybody to say, this is PPI, this is what it's about, what you're covered for, not covered for.
It was only when Nahida saw news reports of the mis-selling scandal that she checked and discovered she had PPI herself.
I've been paying for a long time, more than 20 years, for something I didn't know I had. Whether I wanted it or didn't want it, it was obviously being charged.
So, convinced that she had a strong case for a refund, Nahida contacted her bank.
Barclays sent me a letter rejecting my claim and implying that I'd actually signed up to PPI, which is totally untrue. They've never given me any other full explanation. There's no evidence from their side to prove that I signed any paperwork.
Unfortunately for Nahida, it came down to her word against Barclays. But if you find yourself in the same position, the bank's word doesn't have to be final. You can appeal.
The Financial Ombudsman Service, or FOS, is an independent body which has the power to overturn banks' decisions and, if necessary, award compensation. It was set up to adjudicate in all kinds of disputes, but ever since the banks were supposed to be compensating PPI customers, it's been creaking under the workload.
Well, this is completely unprecedented.
Natalie Seeley is the Chief Ombudsman and Chief Executive of the service.
Unfortunately now, there are millions of people out there who have been denied justice for a very long time. And for the Ombudsman Service, we're doing one of the biggest clean-ups in financial services history.
The Ombudsman are receiving so many complaints about banks rejecting customers' PPI claims that they've had to double the number of staff.
It's now hit unprecedented volumes. In fact, last week we received our 500,000th complaint about the subject, and now every working day we're getting around 4,000 phone calls about PPI mis-selling and taking in 1,000 or more new complaints to investigate.
What is the volume of cases that you have overturned, i.e. you've gone back on the bank's decision, overruled it in fact?
Over those cases, something like 3/4 of those customers we've awarded compensation.
And the worst banks for refusing to pay out? Lloyds and Barclays. In the first 6 months of the year, the Ombudsman received 9,500 complaints about Lloyds. 98% of those were upheld, meaning Lloyds had to pay out. In the same period, there were a staggering 19,500 complaints about mis-selling by Barclays, and of those, 93% were upheld.
I'm totally angry and furious, and I don't think I would ever sign up for anything at all with Barclays. I think it's totally unfair because I don't actually think they've actually looked into any of the paperwork, because you know, where I've supplied them with a huge amount of evidence and proof to state my case, but I haven't had anything back but a 2-line letter to say they're rejecting my claim.
Critics accuse the banks of using a range of tactics to fob customers off or reject their entirely legitimate claims. According to the Ombudsman, some even go as far as saying the customer never had PPI in the first place.
Well, we're getting a lot of banks saying these consumers never had policies, they're trying it on. When we ask just a few more questions, we find that actually about a quarter of consumers did have PPI. And then we go on to investigate whether or not they were missold.
Following the worst mis-selling scandal in UK financial history, the banks are supposed to be putting things right. On this evidence, some are failing spectacularly. But this time, the rest of us may not have to pay for their failings.
The nice thing about the Ombudsman Service is we've got legally binding powers, so what we decide the banks have to do. So if people do think they were missold, of course they've got to look at their bank first, but if they don't think they've got justice, that is what we're here for.
Fiona Phillips reporting there. Now, Lloyds says the Financial Ombudsman's figures, which show 98% of appeals being found in customers' favour, relate to historic processes and procedures. It says that for a short period last year there were problems in distributing PPI compensation to customers. Whilst these were swiftly resolved, they're likely to have an impact on the Ombudsman's figures.
Meanwhile, a result from Barclays. The bank has now apologised to Nahida Goodchild and promised to pay her back in full. It insists claims management companies are largely to blame for clogging up the PPI complaint system and says its own processing time has been cut. And complaints to the Ombudsman are at their lowest for 3 years.